You need to leave the family business behind, Rebecca. You were never one of us. The words landed in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of Lawson Sons like they had been waiting for me before I ever stepped off the elevator. I stood near the long walnut table in a black dress, my coat still folded over one arm, my wedding ring cold against my finger, and the old brown leather envelope Andrew had left me pressed quietly against my side. Outside the windows, downtown Chicago moved like any other Tuesday morning, taxis sliding along Michigan Avenue, office workers rushing with coffee cups, the gray November sky hanging low over the city. But inside that room, everything had been arranged to make me feel small. Andrew's chair was empty at the head of the table, the chair he used to come home too tired to talk about, the chair he once told me felt heavier than any crown. His older brother, Charles Lawson, sat beside it as if he had already inherited the right to lean back in it. His mother, Margaret, wore pearls and grief like matching accessories. His sister, Diane, had a pen ready in her hand before anyone asked me to sit. Even the company attorney they had chosen, a thin man with silver glasses, kept his eyes on the stack of papers in front of him instead of looking at me. I realized then that this was never meant to be a meeting. It was meant to be a dismissal. Charles tapped one finger against the document closest to him, and gave me the kind of smile people use when they want cruelty to sound professional. We all loved Andrew, he said, though his voice had none of the ache that name still carried for me. But Lawson Sons has to move forward, and the last thing this company needs is confusion about who belongs in the room. I looked at the black and white photograph behind him, Andrew shaking hands with his father in front of the first Lawson warehouse, back when the company sold construction supplies out of a rented building on the edge of town. Andrew had kept that photograph even after his father's mistakes nearly buried the business. He believed names could be redeemed. He believed loyalty still meant something. Maybe that was why he had loved me. Maybe that was why he had warned me. Margaret pushed a cream-colored envelope toward me. "This is a generous transition offer," she said. "Enough for you to be comfortable. No one is trying to be unkind." Diane looked me up and down, from my plain black heels to the simple coat I had bought on sale 3 winters earlier. "Honestly, Rebecca, it is better this way. You were Andrew's wife, not his business partner." No one noticed my fingers tighten around the leather envelope. No one noticed that I had not looked surprised. They only saw a widow they expected to cry, sign, and disappear. Charles uncapped his pen and slid it across the table. "Take the check," he said. "Leave the company to the family." I looked at the pen, then at Andrew's empty chair, and for the first time since I entered that room, I smiled. That smile unsettled them more than tears would have. I saw it in the way Diane stopped tapping her pen, in the way Margaret lifted her chin, in the way Charles leaned forward as if my face had done something disrespectful. For weeks after Andrew's funeral, they had treated my silence like surrender. They had sent flowers with no note, then sent messages through assistants instead of calling me directly. They had removed my name from the company holiday invitation list before the funeral programs had even been packed away. They had changed the locks on Andrew's private office and told the receptionist I did not need access anymore. Every move had been quiet, polite, and polished enough to deny later. That was the Lawson way. They never slammed a door if they could close it with a smile and pretend it had opened by itself. The papers in front of me proved they had been planning this morning carefully. There was a resignation statement written in my name, saying I wished to step away from any connection to Lawson Sons so the family could grieve and lead without distraction. There was a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to hide a dozen insults. There was a settlement check folded inside a separate envelope, made out for an amount that would have seemed large to anyone who did not know what Andrew had built, and insulting to anyone who did. There was even a draft announcement for the company website, thanking me for my grace during a difficult transition, as if they had already decided the ending and only needed my signature to make it look clean. I looked from one document to the next, taking my time, letting the silence stretch until the air conditioner humming above us became the loudest sound in the room. Charles hated silence. He always had. At family dinners, he filled it with stories about deals he had not closed and sacrifices he had not made. At company events, he talked over warehouse managers, drivers, sales directors, anyone whose hands had actually touched the work. Andrew used to squeeze my knee under the table whenever Charles started performing. It was our private joke, a small signal that meant, let him talk. People reveal themselves when they think no one is listening. So I let Charles talk now. This is not personal, he said, though every word in that room had been sharpened for me. The board needs stability. Vendors need confidence. Employees need to see that leadership remains with the Lawson family. I nodded slowly. And you believe I am a threat to that stability? Diane gave a soft laugh. Rebecca, please. You are not a threat. That is the point. Margaret reached for her coffee cup, her diamond bracelet flashing under the conference room lights. You have been through enough. No one expects you to understand the pressure of running a company this size. Her voice softened in a way that might have fooled someone who did not know her. Andrew protected you from all of this. I looked down at the leather envelope in my lap. Andrew had not protected me from the business. He had protected the business with me. But they were not ready to hear that yet. Charles pushed the pen closer, and the tiny sound of metal rolling against polished wood made everyone look at my hands. They expected them to shake. They expected grief to make me careless, or embarrassment to make me grateful. But grief had done something else to me. It had burned away the need to explain myself to people who had already written me out of their version of the truth. I picked up the first document, not the pen, and read the opening sentence aloud. I, Rebecca Lawson, voluntarily resign from any advisory, financial, or informal role connected to Lawson Sons Holdings. I looked up. That is interesting wording. The company attorney cleared his throat. Standard language? Standard for someone with a role, I said. I thought Diane just said I did not have one. For half a second, no one answered. Diane's mouth tightened. Margaret set her coffee down. Charles gave a patient sigh, the kind he used when he wanted other people in the room to see him as reasonable. Rebecca, we are trying to protect everyone, including you. Andrew's passing created emotional confusion. You may believe certain conversations gave you influence here, but dinner table opinions are not corporate authority. A few people along the far side of the table shifted in their seats. I recognized some of them from company Christmas parties, golf fundraisers, and ribbon cuttings where I had stood beside Andrew, while the Lawson family introduced me as his lovely wife and nothing more. There was Martin Hales from operations, who had once thanked me quietly because Andrew approved a warehouse safety upgrade after I spent one afternoon listening to drivers talk about broken loading ramps. There was Ellen Pierce from finance, who had looked at me too long when I entered the room, as if she knew more than she was allowed to say. There was a younger board member named Grant Whitmore, brought in 2 years earlier after a bank refinancing, staring at the leather envelope in my lap with a careful expression. They were not all against me. That mattered. Andrew had told me it would. A room will always have cowards, he once said, sitting beside me in our kitchen at 2 a.m, invoices spread between our coffee mugs. But it will also have witnesses. Charles reached for another page. The settlement offer is more than fair. $250,000, immediate payment, plus continued health coverage for 12 months. Most people would consider that generous. Margaret nodded, satisfied with the number, as if generosity could be measured only by how little pain it caused the giver. Diane added, It would allow you to start over somewhere quieter. Maybe back near Milwaukee, where your sister lives. That was when I understood how much they had discussed me when I was not in the room. They knew where my sister lived. They knew what coat I wore. They knew what amount they thought would tempt me. But they had never bothered to learn why Andrew always brought every final contract home before signing it, why he never made a major acquisition without taking a long walk with me around Lincoln Park first, why the bank president shook my hand before he shook Charles's at the anniversary dinner last spring. They had mistaken discretion for absence. They had mistaken humility for ignorance. I placed the resignation statement back on the table and slid it away from me with 2 fingers. Before I sign anything, I said, I want to understand the story you are planning to tell the employees. Charles blinked. Excuse me? I picked up the draft announcement and read from it calmly. Rebecca Lawson has chosen to step away from the company to focus on healing and private matters. I let the sentence hang there. That is a very clean lie. The room changed then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But I felt it. The tiny shift when people realize the person they cornered has stopped acting cornered. Charles stared at me as if the word lie had dirted the furniture. For years, that had been the Lawson family's greatest talent, making ugly things sound respectable. A threat became a recommendation. Greed became responsibility. Erasing someone became protecting the future. I had watched them do it so often that I could almost admire the craftsmanship, if I had not been the person they were trying to erase. Careful, Charles said softly. Emotions can make people reckless. I folded my hands over the leather envelope and looked at him without raising my voice. Then it is fortunate I am not being emotional. That was not entirely true. My grief was there, steady and deep, but it was not the kind they knew how to use against me. It did not make me weak. It made me precise. In that moment, with the city gray beyond the glass and Andrew's empty chair at the head of the table, I remembered a night 7 years earlier when Lawson Sons was not a polished name on a downtown tower. It was a company gasping for air. Andrew had come home after midnight, his tie loose, his face pale from another meeting with lenders who smiled while asking for guarantees they knew he could not provide. We had been living in a modest brick house in Oak Park then, the kind with old radiators that clicked in winter and a kitchen too small for the table his mother said was not good enough for company. Andrew set a cardboard box of files beside the sink and told me the truth before anyone else in his family heard it. The company was 30 days from missing payroll. Their main supplier had tightened credit. The bank was nervous. Charles had promised investors he did not have. Margaret wanted to sell a warehouse and pretend it was strategy. Diane wanted to cut employees who had been with them for 20 years. Andrew, exhausted and ashamed, said, I cannot let my father's name become the reason good people lose their jobs. I still remembered standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tile, listening to the refrigerator hum while he explained numbers no family dinner had ever mentioned. I had savings from the sale of my late father's small manufacturing shop in Wisconsin, money I had never flaunted because my parents had taught me that security was not something to wave around. I also had experience Andrew's family never respected. I knew inventory. I knew margins. I knew how a business could look alive on paper while quietly bleeding to death. We stayed up until sunrise with coffee, spreadsheets, and legal pads, building a rescue plan while snow gathered along the window ledge. When I offered the first investment, Andrew refused until his eyes filled. Not because he was too proud to accept help, but because he knew what his family would say if they found out. They would call me controlling. They would call him weak. They would take the money, then punish us for needing it. So his attorney drafted the partnership privately. My name stayed hidden, my rights stayed protected, and Andrew made me promise that if the day ever came when the Lawsons tried to gut the company for themselves, I would not stay silent for the sake of peace. Back in the conference room, Charles was still waiting for me to apologize. Instead, I reached into my purse, took out my phone, and placed it face up on the table. Before we continue, I said, my attorney is on his way up. Diane gave a short laugh. Your attorney? I looked toward the door as the elevator bell sounded faintly beyond the frosted glass. Andrew's attorney, I said. There is a difference. The conference room door opened before anyone could decide whether to challenge me, and Nathaniel Brooks stepped inside with a navy overcoat folded over one arm and a black leather briefcase in his other hand. He was not the attorney sitting beside Charles. He was not polished in the same harmless way. Nathaniel had represented Andrew for nearly 15 years, through bank negotiations, supplier disputes, land purchases, and the kind of private agreements families pretend do not exist until the signatures become impossible to ignore. His hair had gone almost completely white since I first met him, but his eyes were the same, calm and sharp enough to make nervous people sit straighter. Ellen Pierce from finance stood halfway out of her chair before she seemed to remember where she was. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly. The room heard the respect in her voice. Charles heard it too, and his expression hardened. "Nathaniel," he said, forcing a smile. "This is a closed family business meeting." Nathaniel removed his glasses from his coat pocket, put them on, and looked around the table as if reading a document only he could see. "Then it is fortunate I represent the person withstanding to be here." Diane let out an impatient breath. "Andrew is gone." Nathaniel turned to her. "I am not referring to Andrew." The silence that followed was clean and immediate. Even Margaret stopped pretending to sip her coffee. I watched Charles glance at the company attorney, whose face had lost the easy confidence he wore when I arrived. Nathaniel walked to my side of the table, placed his briefcase beside the unsigned papers, and gave me a small nod. Not pity. Not comfort. Recognition. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, "would you like me to proceed?" That single question did what years of polite introductions never had. It made everyone in that room look at me as if my answer mattered. I opened the old leather envelope Andrew had left in the top drawer of his nightstand with a note that said, "Only when they make you feel alone." Inside were documents I already knew by heart, but my fingers still moved carefully because Andrew had touched them last. The first page was cream-colored, thicker than ordinary office paper, with a notary seal pressed near the bottom and Andrew's signature beside mine. Nathaniel took it when I handed it to him, then placed it in the center of the table where Charles's pen had been waiting for me. "For the record," Nathaniel said, "this is the silent partnership agreement executed 7 years ago between Andrew Lawson, Rebecca Lawson, and Lawson Sons Holdings, later amended after the company restructuring and refinancing." Charles gave a short laugh that sounded more like a cough. "That is impossible." Nathaniel did not look offended. Men like him rarely wasted energy on disbelief. "It is not impossible. It is filed, notarized, and referenced in 3 subsequent corporate resolutions." Margaret's face paled beneath her makeup. "Andrew would have told us." I finally turned to her. "No, Margaret. He knew exactly what you would have done if he had." Nathaniel opened his briefcase and removed a second folder, then a third. "Mrs. Lawson's capital contribution was used to stabilize payroll, secure supplier credit, and prevent default during the winter refinancing period. In exchange, she received a protected equity position, veto rights over any major asset sale, and conditional voting control upon Andrew Lawson's death or incapacity." Grant Whitmore leaned forward, his eyes moving across the page. Martin Hales stared at me like a man remembering every time Andrew had said, "I will discuss it at home first." Diane shook her head slowly. "She was his wife. That money was basically Andrew's." My voice stayed quiet. "It came from my father's business, sold before I married Andrew. Every dollar was separate property. Every transfer was documented." Charles pushed back from the table. "This is absurd." Nathaniel lifted one page, turned it toward him, and read the sentence that changed the room. "Rebecca Lawson is not required to resign from Lawson Sons. Rebecca Lawson currently holds the authority to approve or block this meeting's proposed actions." Then he looked directly at Charles. "Including the attempt to remove herself." For the first time that morning, Charles did not have a sentence ready. He looked at the papers, then at Nathaniel, then at me, as if the truth might change shape if he refused to focus on it for too long. Diane reached for the agreement before Nathaniel placed his hand lightly over the folder. "Copies will be provided," he said. "Original documents will remain with counsel." That small correction embarrassed her more than a louder one would have. Her cheeks colored, and she leaned back with the kind of anger that comes from realizing the rules suddenly apply to you. Margaret looked at me with something colder than grief. "So this was planned," she said. "You and Andrew hid this from his own family." I breathed in slowly. The room still smelled faintly of coffee, leather chairs, and expensive perfume, but beneath it was something sharper now, fear disguised as offense. "Andrew hid it because the company needed saving, not another Lawson argument," I said. "At the time, your family was not looking for solutions. Charles wanted more credit. Diane wanted layoffs. You wanted appearances protected. Andrew wanted payroll covered by Friday." Martin Hales lowered his eyes, and I knew he remembered that winter. He had been the one who called Andrew at home because warehouse employees were asking whether their checks would clear before Christmas. Andrew had gone pale after that call. He had not slept for 2 nights. Charles gave a dismissive shake of his head. "Every company has difficult seasons. Do not make yourself into some kind of savior because you wrote a check." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and wondered how Andrew had carried the weight of that arrogance for so many years. "It was not one check," I said. Nathaniel opened another folder. "Initial capital contribution, $1.8 million. Secondary bridge funding, $900,000. Personal guarantee support during bank restructuring, documented separately. Additional capital injection during the Midwest expansion, $3.2 million. The numbers moved through the room like doors locking one after another. Grant Whitmore took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Ellen Pierce closed her notebook, not because the meeting was over, but because she no longer needed to pretend she did not know where this was going. Diane whispered, "That cannot be right." "It is right," Ellen said before she could stop herself. Every head turned toward her. She swallowed, then continued in a steadier voice. "I saw the transfers. I did not know the full agreement, but I knew the funding did not come from Charles." Charles's face tightened. "Ellen, I would suggest you remember who signs your reviews." Nathaniel turned one page without looking up. "That would be Mrs. Lawson now, depending on how this board chooses to proceed." The shift was almost silent, but it was complete. The employees in the room stopped looking at Charles for permission. They looked at me. I did not enjoy it the way Diane would have. I did not feel triumphant the way Charles might have. I only felt the ache of Andrew's absence, because he should have been there to see that the truth had survived him. I placed my palm over the leather envelope and said, "I did not come here to embarrass anyone. I came because you tried to make me sign away rights you knew I might not understand while I was still grieving." Margaret's voice dropped. "You are accusing your family." "No," I said. "I am describing what happened in this room." Charles stood abruptly, pushing his chair back just enough to make the legs scrape against the carpet. He caught himself and smoothed his jacket, trying to reclaim dignity. "This meeting is adjourned." Nathaniel looked at me. I looked at the unsigned resignation statement, then at Andrew's empty chair. "No," I said, calm enough that my own voice surprised me. "This meeting is just beginning." Charles looked at me as if he had misheard, but no one else moved to leave. That was the moment I understood power did not always announce itself with a raised voice. Sometimes it arrived when a room simply stopped obeying the loudest person in it. Nathaniel placed another folder on the table, this one marked with a red tab. Charles saw it, and went still. Diane noticed his reaction and glanced between us. Margaret's fingers tightened around her coffee cup until her knuckles turned pale. "What is that?" Charles asked. His voice was lower now, less polished. Nathaniel did not answer immediately. He opened the folder and removed a printed letter of intent, several email chains, and a summary of proposed asset transfers. Then he slid them toward the center of the table where everyone could see the logo at the top of the first page. Northbridge Industrial Group. The name alone changed the air. Martin Hales sat forward. Ellen Pierce closed her eyes for a second, as if a suspicion she had carried alone had finally become visible. Grant Whitmore whispered, "You were negotiating with Northbridge?" Charles shot him a warning look. "Preliminary conversations only. Responsible leadership explores options." I looked at the document in front of him. Responsible leadership does not hide a sale from the board while preparing to force out the one person with veto authority. Diane's face hardened. "You do not understand what that sale would have done." "I understand exactly what it would have done," I said. "It would have closed the Joliet distribution center within 90 days. It would have sold the Milwaukee warehouse for the land value. It would have replaced long-term drivers with outside contractors. It would have given Charles a retention bonus large enough to call it a victory while everyone else called it unemployment. The room went silent again, but this time the silence did not belong to me. It belonged to them. Charles turned toward Nathaniel. Those documents are confidential. Nathaniel adjusted his glasses. They were found in Andrew Lawson's secure files after his passing, along with notes requesting that Mrs. Lawson be notified if this transaction moved forward. My chest tightened at Andrew's name. Even now, even gone, he had left breadcrumbs through the dark for me to follow. Nathaniel handed me a smaller envelope, one I had not opened before that morning. My name was written across the front in Andrew's careful handwriting. I did not want to open it in front of them. I wanted to take it home, sit at our kitchen table, and pretend for one more minute that he might walk in, loosen his tie, and ask why I was crying over paperwork. But this was the room he had prepared me for. I opened the envelope and unfolded the single page inside. His words were brief. Rebecca, if they are reading this with you in the room, then they have chosen the company's shell over its soul. Do not let them sell the people who kept my family name alive when my family almost ruined it. You know what to do. I read it once silently, then placed it flat on the table. No one asked to touch it. Margaret stared at the handwriting like it had accused her out loud. Andrew was ill, she said weakly. He may not have understood everything. My grief flared, but I kept my voice steady. Andrew understood more than any of you wanted him to. Charles leaned forward. You cannot block a strategic sale because of sentiment. I turned to Grant. According to the amended agreement, what qualifies as a major asset sale? Grant looked at Nathaniel, then at the documents, then answered carefully. Sale of operating divisions, real estate holdings, or controlling interests. And what does that require? I asked. His voice was quiet. Approval from the protected equity holder. I nodded. Then let the minutes reflect that I do not approve the Northbridge transaction. Charles stared at me with pure disbelief. I looked back at him, thinking of Andrew, the warehouse workers, the drivers, the office staff, the people who had trusted a family name that his family was ready to cash out. You asked me to leave quietly, I said. But Andrew did not leave me silence. He left me responsibility. Charles's face changed when I said responsibility, because responsibility was the one word the Lawson family had always used in speeches and avoided in private. He looked toward Margaret, then Diane, searching for the old agreement between them. The silent family habit of closing ranks until the outsider felt foolish for standing alone. But I was not alone anymore. Nathaniel stood beside me with Andrew's documents. Ellen Pierce sat across from me with the truth of the transfers in her memory. Martin Hales had both hands folded on the table, his expression heavy with the knowledge that the Joliet workers had nearly been traded away without warning. Grant Whitmore was reading the amended agreement line by line, and every sentence seemed to pull him farther from Charles. You are turning this into theater, Charles said, but his voice had lost its shine. No, I said. I am turning it into minutes. Nathaniel gave the smallest nod and opened his notebook. I looked at the company attorney who had arrived ready to watch me sign my own disappearance. Please record that the proposed resignation document was presented to me without prior notice, without my counsel present, and with language designed to misrepresent my legal position. The attorney hesitated. Mrs. Lawson, I represent the company. Exactly, I said. Not Charles. The words settled so firmly that even Charles did not interrupt. Diane pushed her chair back and stood, her face tight with humiliation. This is ridiculous. You walk in here with old paperwork and suddenly expect everyone to bow. I looked at her, remembering every holiday dinner where she asked what I did all day while Andrew worked, every charity luncheon where she introduced me as Sweet Rebecca, as if kindness and intelligence could not live in the same woman. I do not want anyone to bow, I said. I want the company protected from the people who were willing to sell it before Andrew's office was even cleaned out. Margaret's eyes glistened, but I could not tell whether it was grief or anger. He was my son, she said. You do not get to use him against us. That one hurt, because once, long before the lawyers and papers and whispered insults, I had wanted her to love me. I had brought pies to Thanksgiving, handwritten birthday cards, sat beside her at hospital appointments when Andrew was traveling, and still she had treated me like a temporary guest in a family that never intended to make room. I am not using Andrew, I said softly. I am honoring what he asked me to protect. Nathaniel placed another document in front of Grant. Under the conditional voting provision, Mrs. Lawson may request an immediate review of executive conduct related to undisclosed sale negotiations. Grant read it, then looked at Charles. That means an independent audit. Charles's jaw tightened. No one is authorizing an audit. I turned to him. I am. The room became perfectly still. Outside, somewhere far below, a siren passed through downtown traffic and faded into the gray morning. Inside, Charles finally understood that the conversation was no longer about whether I belonged there. It was about whether he did. I continued before he could recover. Effective immediately, no assets are to be sold, no layoffs are to be announced, no vendor contracts are to be transferred, and no communications about my departure are to be released. Ellen, I would like a full cash flow report by tomorrow morning. Martin, I want a list of employees affected by the Northbridge proposal. Grant, please coordinate with Nathaniel for a board compliance review. Ellen nodded first. Then Martin. Then Grant. 3 small movements, but to Charles, they must have sounded like doors closing. Diane stared at them as if loyalty had betrayed her. Margaret looked away. Charles gathered the unsigned papers in front of him, but Nathaniel calmly placed one hand on the resignation statement. That document belongs in the record now. Charles released it. I stood slowly, not because I wanted to dominate the room, but because my legs had finally stopped feeling like grief was holding them down. I walked to Andrew's empty chair and rested my fingers on the back of it. The leather was cool. I could almost hear his voice telling me to breathe. Then I looked at the family who had prepared a check to remove me and said, You wanted me to leave quietly. Instead, I am staying legally. The audit began before noon, and by 5 o'clock that afternoon, the story Charles had prepared for the company was dead. No announcement went out saying I had stepped away to heal in private. No quiet sale to Northbridge moved forward. No employees in Joliet or Milwaukee were told their years of loyalty had been reduced to numbers on a buyer's spreadsheet. Instead, a different message appeared in every inbox at Lawson Sons, written with Nathaniel beside me and approved by the board after Grant called an emergency vote. It said the company would remain independent, all pending asset negotiations were suspended, and I would serve as interim chair during the compliance review. I read that email 3 times before sending it, not because I doubted the words, but because I wished Andrew could have seen them. 2 weeks later, I walked back into the same conference room. The weather had changed by then. Chicago had turned colder, and thin snow rested along the window ledges high above the street. Andrew's chair was no longer empty in the same way. It still carried his absence, but it no longer felt stolen. Charles sat at the far end of the table this time, not beside the head chair. Diane would not look at me. Margaret had not returned to the office since the first meeting, though Nathaniel told me her attorney had requested copies of every document she once claimed could not exist. Ellen placed the completed cash flow report in front of me. Martin handed over a list of employees whose jobs would have vanished under the Northbridge proposal. Grant presented the audit findings in a measured voice, careful and professional, but every page made the truth harder to soften. Undisclosed negotiations. Personal bonus arrangements. Improper pressure on staff. A prepared resignation statement drafted for me without proper authority. None of it was shouted. None of it needed to be. Paper had a voice of its own when people finally stopped talking over it. Charles resigned before the board could remove him. Diane gave up her advisory role before anyone asked for a vote. Their departures were described publicly as a leadership transition, because I refused to humiliate the company just to satisfy my pride. That surprised them more than anger would have. They had expected revenge, because revenge was what they would have wanted in my place. But Andrew had not trusted me with his life's work so I could turn his name into a battlefield. He had trusted me to protect it. On my first full morning as chair, I drove to the Joliet Distribution Center instead of staying in the downtown office. I wore the same black coat Diane once looked at with pity, and I stood in a warehouse break room that smelled like coffee, cardboard, and winter air. The employees gathered slowly, uncertain at first, until Martin introduced me not as Andrew's widow, not as a temporary figure, but as the person who had helped keep their paychecks alive years earlier when the company nearly failed. A driver named Paul removed his cap and said, "We never knew." I looked at the faces in that room, people Andrew had worried about by name, people his family had almost traded away for a cleaner balance sheet, and I felt the ache in my chest soften into something steadier. "You were not supposed to know," I said. "You were only supposed to be protected." Months later, the Lawson name stayed on the building, but the meaning of it changed. We invested in safer loading docks, renewed supplier contracts, and created an employee profit-sharing plan Andrew had sketched in a notebook but never lived long enough to finish. I kept his photograph in the conference room, not above the chair like a shrine, but near the window where morning light touched the frame. Sometimes, before a hard meeting, I would glance at it and remember the night he asked me to be brave when peace became too expensive. The family who once told me to take a check and disappear learned that silence was not weakness, plain clothes were not poverty, and a woman standing alone was not always alone. I never needed their permission to belong. I had been carrying the proof in my hands all along.